Today we're going to be learning Sukkah Daf Mem Bet. Today's daf is dedicated by Tova and David Kestenbaum in honor of Tova's parents, Rabbi Dr. Israel and Rebecca Rifkin, who are making Aliyah today. We, your children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, are anxiously awaiting your arrival in Israel and wish you many more years of good health and nachat from all of us. And by Jeanne Klempner, in honor of her father's 83rd birthday this week, his second bar mitzvah, and for his refuah shlema Elimelech ben Malka. Okay, we are going to start our daf from the very bottom of Mem Aleph Amud Bet. We saw Rabbi Yossi Omer Yom Tov. It was a quote from the Mishnah. Yom Tov Harishon Shel Chag, the first day of Sukkot that falls out on Shabbat, and he forgot and accidentally took his lulav through the public domain. Patur mipnei shotzio b'reshut. He's exempt because he did it with permission. What does it mean, permission? It means he did it by accident as he was trying to do a mitzvah. In other words, he was trying to do something good. Something bad accidentally came out of it. Normally, if you accidentally, unwittingly do something on Shabbat, a malacha, like carrying, you would have to bring a korban chatat, a sin offering. In this case, you're exempt from the sin offering, as we're going to see, because he holds what's called ta'abid var mitzvah patur. If you make a mistake while doing a mitzvah, you're exempt. Question is going to be what type of mistake and what does it mean to be involved in a mitzvah? So we're now going to see Amar Abaye. Abaye says, Lo shanu ela shelo yatzabo. It's only if it's before you did the mitzvah, it's on the way to do the mitzvah. Aval yatzabo chayav. But if you already fulfilled your obligation, then that's no longer called to abid var mitzvah. We're going to see that there's a few issues involved here. So one is that Rashi says here, V'lo tarud mehashta b'mitzvah la'asota. The end of the first dibur matchil of Rashi here, lo shanu, the last few words on the third line. He's not tarud. He's not. We've seen this tirdah before. You're focused on accomplishing that mitzvah. That sometimes distracts you. We all know things distract us and you forget other things because you're busy. So busy trying to do the mitzvah. Once the mitzvah is done, you're not busy with it anymore. So comes the Gemara and concludes from here, Hamida'ad behei nafik beh, but wait, or questions and says, but wait. As soon as he picks up the lulav to carry it, he's already fulfilled his obligation because he's picked up the lulav. That's the mitzvah. So Amar Abaye, we're going to have two possible answers. Rabbi says, Kishafcho, it must be he had it upside down. Remember, we discussed this when we talked about Over Lasiyatan. First, you have to make the bracha, then do the mitzvah. So you have to have one thing at least upside down so that you don't fulfill the mitzvah in that way. Rav Amar, filu tema shelo afcho, even if you didn't flip it over, maybe you carried it in a vessel and then you weren't carrying it directly. Now, what's strange about this, which is the Gemara's question, remember Rava and Rabba and the debate between them a few dapim ago about which situation it's a chatzitza, right, on Daf Lamed Zayin. So, ha Rava, hu da'amar, l'kicha yedei davar acher shma l'kicha. Rava was the one who said that if you take something while you're holding something else, it's considered likicha. That is taking it, which means if you hold the lulav in a utensil, the fact that you're holding the lulav doesn't matter if there's something in between you and the lulav, that's still considered taking it. So now the Gemara says not exactly. There, the case was, if you remember, he took a cloth and was holding the lulav with a cloth. Is that considered a barrier? So he said no. But that, when he says that it works, it's not a barrier. Hanemile derech kavod. That's only if you do it in a respectful manner, meaning you were trying to fulfill the mitzvah that way. Then it works. But aval derech bizayon lo, but not if you're disgracing it. Now here, disgrace is a little bit of an extreme. But what they mean is you weren't taking it to do the mitzvah. You were just carrying it somewhere. That's not carrying it, right? The way you carry your lulav to shul, let's say. You don't carry it in the most respectful manner. You're not really carrying it. You're just kind of schlepping it along. That's considered here, derech bizayon. That's not considered that you took the lulav and you carried it. So therefore, it's not, that's not really a question here. Amar Rav Huna, Omer Chaya Rabbi Yossi. Now he furthermore says, Rabbi Yossi has this concept that you make a mistake doing a mitzvah, you're exempt from sacrifice, right, for doing something unwittingly. So Rav Huna says that Rabbi Yossi would also say, Olat ha'of shenimtzeit ben agafayim. Okay, we need some background. There's different bird offerings in the temple. One is an ola, a burnt offering, which all gets offered to God. None of it gets eaten. Another type is a chatat. A chatat is a sin offering, which the bird, part of it gets burnt on the altar, part of it gets eaten by the male kohanim. So now, let's say you're a male kohen and you're in the temple, and you have an olat ha'of that's mixed up between a bunch of other birds. V'kasavur chatata ofi, and he thought it was a chatata of. Now it's a mitzvah to eat the sacrificial meat. So he thought it was a chatata of, and he thought he was doing a mitzvah. V'achla, and he ate it, but it turned out it was an ola that was supposed to be entirely burned. Patul, he's exempt from eating, right? You're not allowed to eat a korban ola, but he's exempt. Why is he exempt? Right? Because he made a mistake thinking he was doing a mitzvah, and it turned out he was wrong, but it was a mistake. So the Gemara says, "My kamash malan." Why did even Rav Huna need to tell us this? It's a typical case of ta'abed var mitzvah, or maybe it's not typical, and we will see. So they say, "My kamash malan." So, right, first the question: what is he coming to teach us? Ta'abed var mitzvah patul. He wants to teach us that if you make a mistake in a mitzvah, Rabbi Yossi says you're exempt. Hainu hach, it's exactly the case of our Mishnah. You don't need Rav Huna to add that he also would have said it about this case. So they say, well, you do. Why? Ma'u detema, you might have thought, hatam hu de ta'abed var mitzvah patul. When you say ta'abed var mitzvah patur, it depends. As I said before, you have to define what's ta'ah, what's bidvar mitzvah. Bidvar mitzvah already, we defined it's only on your way to do the mitzvah, not when you're finished with the mitzvah. Now we're going to say, maybe you might have thought that it was only hainu da'avad mitzvah, only if in the end you actually fulfill a mitzvah. Like in our case, you carried it through the public domain, let's say to get to shul, and in shul you did the mitzvah. That would be ta'abed var mitzvah. But aval hacha, de ta'abed var mitzvah, v'lo avad mitzvah. In this case, you thought you were doing a mitzvah. You went to go eat it. You ate it, but it turns out you didn't accomplish any mitzvah because there was no mitzvah here to eat the meat, right? You didn't eat the meat in the end. You ate the wrong meat. You ate olat ha'of, but there's no mitzvah to eat it. So you didn't actually fulfill the mitzvah. Malo, maybe you would think you're not exempt in that case. Kamash malan, that's why Rav Huna teaches us, no, in fact, he thinks you still are exempt. Now we're going to bring a contradiction, meitive, contradiction to the way Rav Huna just explained this, because let's try another case where you think you're doing a mitzvah, in the end you don't, and here we're going to see you're not exempt. And it's said in the name of Rabbi Yossi. In this bright, it says, Rabbi Yossi omer, hashochet et hatamid she'eino mevukal k'ilchato b'shabbat chayav chatat, v'tzarich tamid acher. So if you accidentally slaughtered a korban tamid, which wasn't checked, what does that mean? They would always check the animals for the korban tamid. It was the daily sacrifice. You're allowed to bring it on Shabbat. So you're allowed to slaughter it on Shabbat. But if you instead of taking an animal that was checked, why do they check them? For blemishes. You can't bring a blemished animal. So you went to take an animal that wasn't checked. Instead of you were supposed to take the animal that was checked. They usually check it 4 days before, usually check it every day of those 4 days. You took an animal that wasn't checked kilchato, the way it was supposed to be checked, this Shabbat, and you took it on Shabbat for the korban tamid, which normally you'd be allowed to slaughter it. But in this case, you took the wrong type of animal. There's a debate whether it actually was blemished, or even if it wasn't blemished, you can only take it from animals that were checked. Okay, so there's a debate about whether it wasn't checked and it was blemished, or it just wasn't checked, and that in and of itself was enough to disqualify the korban. So therefore, chayav chatat, you're liable. You have to bring a korban chatat, a sin offering, because you slaughtered something on Shabbat that you weren't allowed to slaughter. V'tzarich tamid acher, and you have to bring a new animal now, a new lamb to slaughter for the sacrifice. So that seems to be saying you didn't fulfill a mitzvah. You thought you were on your way to do a mitzvah, but you didn't end up fulfilling the mitzvah. It doesn't work. Well, Amar Le, he answers him back. Bar minei dahu. No, that's an exception. That one's different. Why? Ta'itmar Allah was said about that source. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Chatai, Amar Rav Nuna Sabas. Pay attention to how many people said in the name of how many people. Okay, so Rav Shmuel bar Chatai said in the name of Rav Hamnuna Saba, the elder. Rav Hamnuna, who said in the name of Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Ashiyan, who said in the name of Amar Rav Huna, who said in the name of Amar Rav. Okay, each one passed down in the name until ultimately it's passed down really from Rav. It wasn't, there was a place called Lishkat HaTzla'im where they would put the lambs that were checked. Now, this person went to a place where those animals, a different place where animals are kept that are not checked. That doesn't qualify as ta'abed var mitzvah. Rashi explains a few things that teach you more about this ta'abed var mitzvah. Number one, he points out, if you look in the Rashi, Dibora matchil milishka she'enam mevukarim, it's the first wide line in Rashi. De'ein zeh ta'abed var mitzvah. Okay, this isn't considered. Why? Shebetzlaim shebelishka zo eino tarud. You're not distracted and focused on the mitzvah if you take from a place like that. It's not like you can make a mistake about those animals because you're always worried, right? When are they going to go on, when are they going to be sacrificed? But in other words, he seems to add this element of time. Even though you're time pressed when it comes to the Korban Tamid, that's not sufficient. Number one, he points out there's the issue of time press. Because we all know that when we're under a time constraint, we often make mistakes, right? How many times you have a deadline for something and then you realize you hand it in and all of a sudden you realize I made a mistake and you just didn't pay attention because you were so hurried to get it in that you made an error. So that's number one, is a time factor. Number two, the other thing that they say we're not worried about that. Why? Here he gives a different reason as to why this is excluded, because you do have the time pressure of the Korban Tamid. Maybe he went to the wrong place by accident. No, that doesn't count. Why not? That doesn't apply here, this time stress. Why? It was more like that if you have a scale of totally accidental, somewhat accidental, shkaga, which is your average. I made a mistake, but it's like I could have been more careful. And then there's karov lemezid. Okay, in Hebrew they call it ones, which is all the way where you're totally, someone put a gun to your head and made you do it is one extreme example of that. But it could be also something you had no control over. Then there's shogeg karov laones. This, by the way, these categories come up when it comes to damages, when it comes to killing someone accidentally, all sorts of times where we take shkaga into consideration. We always have to, shkaga is the middle. It's where it's not karov laones, but it's also not karov lemezid. It's also not close to intentional. Once you get a shkaga that's karov lemezid, then already you're not going to have this exemption or whatever constitutes shkaga for whatever it might be, whether it's running to the refuge city because you accidentally killed someone or being liable for, being able to bring a sacrifice to atone for yourself. If it's already more like mezi, we don't allow you to atone for yourself. So here they're going to say, you don't get the exemption from the korban because you're karov lemezi, because you weren't even careful to which place you went to take them. There's a clear distinction between the animals that were checked and the animals that weren't. You went to the wrong place. That doesn't qualify under ta'abed var mitzvah, but that's not the same as the birds got mixed up and you took the wrong bird and you ate it thinking you were doing a mitzvah. Then we're going to exempt you. This case, you're more karov lemezid. Okay, so you learn from Rashi that in order to qualify for ta'abed var mitzvah, it has to be shkaga. You were less responsible for your mistake. And there's usually a time factor here that because you're time pressured, that's what gives you this exemption. Okay, new Mishnah. Here we're going to get into women, an interesting way of how to read this. There's different ways about how to read this Mishnah, why they chose a woman here. A woman can accept the lulav from her son or from her husband, and she can put it back in water on Shabbat. Apparently, they would leave it in water as part of the mitzvah of Hidur in order to make sure that it stays nice. So in the time of the temple, when they were allowed to take the lulav on the first day, when the first day fell on Shabbat, we'll get more into that soon, a woman can take the lulav back from her husband or her son and put it in water. Why a woman? Does it mean particularly a woman? Right? It's a good question. Is this particularly geared toward women? Obviously, men can do it. The chiddush here is even women, which we'll talk about in a minute, why a woman can do this. Number two, right, and the issue is really, right, that it's a muktzah issue, okay? There's an issue with putting things in water. That's a whole other issue. Normally, we don't put flowers in water on Shabbat. So interestingly, I saw the Rama Paskins in the Shulchan Aruch. I'm not going to say this is the Psikat Halacha, but he does say that if you're putting something in water that doesn't have buds and the flowers are already open, then it's not a problem. Okay, halacha l'maaseh, I don't think we do this. I think in general, we don't put anything in water, but it's worth checking into. Like let's say you cut spices, can you leave them in water or not? I didn't check this out in the halacha. This is not a halacha class, but I'm just pointing out that would come out of here. That's what I thought of immediately about putting spices. Some people put spices in water to keep them fresh. Are you allowed to do that on Shabbat and then put them back in? Here it seems to be because it's a mitzvah, we allow you to do that. But the issue really they're grappling with here is, in addition to that, it's the issue of, and that's really the issue, is muktzah. This is no longer needed for a mitzvah today anyway. So theoretically, it's muktzah. Is it muktzah is the question for anybody. And it's just giving an example of a woman because that might be the typical. The man comes in, he gives it to the woman to deal with, right? That was her job. again, it was her job, technically, or not her job. It's more, that's the way society worked. The women were in charge of that kind of thing, right? They took care of that. Or is it specifically saying a woman? And it's telling you that a woman, okay, now why specifically a woman? So we're going to get to this in the Gemara, and we'll see in about 2 minutes. So now, right, obviously the main difference between a man and a woman is the woman's not obligated in the mitzvah of lulav. Why that would have effects on this, we'll talk about it in a minute. Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'Shabbat machzirin, he says, agrees with Tanakama that on Shabbat you can put it back in water. B'Yom Tov mosifin, on Yom Tov you can even add water to wherever it's in. Let's say you need more water, the water's evaporating. Ubimoed machlifin, and on Chol Hamoed you can even switch the water. Some people say, what do you mean you can switch the water? Of course you could switch the water. What malacha would there be on Yom Tov? So some people explain what it means is it's telling you have to switch the water, just like you have flowers. And after a few days, you want to switch the water. Likewise here, you have to switch the water. It's better for them. So again, this is part of the mitzvah of Hidur. To make it look nice, you should switch the water so that you have fresh water, keeping it fresh. The last line of the Mishnah is a minor who knows how to shake a lulav is already obligated in lulav. This is also a good question. Obligated from what sense? Aren't they only obligated at 13? So one could say, no, maybe in the Mishnah times, they were actually obligated at an earlier age. And it didn't always go by age, right? At some point it became age, but we've seen this many times. There's certain times where you're already liable. You're already obligated in the mitzvah, even at a younger age. Once you're capable of doing the mitzvah, you're obligated. It was much more fluid in those years and not in those times, and not like it is today where it's cut off age. At this age, you're already obligated. Other people say it's midin chinuch, and then the question becomes, chinuch is teaching the child how to do things. When do you start teaching them? And then the question becomes, well, does that mean they're obligated? Now, chinuch would be on a Rabbanan level, right? If we said the first option, it would be on a Torah level. Maybe it's only Rabbanan, and then the child is obligated Rabbanan on a rabbinic level. Some people say, no. How could you obligate a child on a rabbinic level, right? They're minors still. So some people say the obligation is on the parent. At a certain point, the parent is obligated to teach the child. It's not that the child has to do it. It's the parent has to make sure the child does it. It's on the parent, not on the child. Those are all interesting, bunch of different ways to understand children under age of 13 and of their obligation in mitzvot, or girls under the age of 12. So the Gemara first starts off with a question about this woman. Pshita, isn't it obvious, right? Why is it obvious that you wouldn't have an issue? Well, the issue they assume right now is that the lulav is muktzah, because it has no use anymore. So maybe you wouldn't be allowed to put it in water. So therefore, we're going to say, but of course it's not muktzah because it's used for the mitzvah. It's not muktzah, right? Muktzah is something that has no use. This has use for the purposes of a mitzvah. So maybe it would be. So they say, well, now the Gemara says, oh, it's specifically the woman they want to teach you here. You might have thought, since she's not obligated in the mitzvah, maybe for her it's muktzah. This is a very interesting thing. So then they say, you might say, Isha la bat chiyuva, ema lo tekabel. Maybe she's not allowed to. Maybe he has to do it himself because for her it's muktzah. Kamash malan. So now what's the kamash malan? So Rashi says the kamash malan teaches you she's not obligated. It's not muktzah for her because there is no such thing as subjective muktzah. For me, it could be muktzah. For you, it's not muktzah. For me, it has no purpose. For you, it does, right? We don't distinguish. Remember, muktzah means something that has no purpose at all. For the woman, it has no purpose because she's not obligated. For the man, has purpose. But you can't have something that's not muktzah for a man, and yes, muktzah for the woman. There is no such thing, even though I do recall that we had a sugya, don't remember when it was, maybe in Psachim, where we saw this idea of maybe there is this idea of subjective muktzah. Again, I'm sorry, I don't remember where it was, but we did have something about possibly something could be subjectively muktzah for one person and not for another, but Rashi seems to read it like that. Rabbeinu Tam would obviously have a different approach. And why Rabbeinu Tam? He is in the early Middle Ages, it started to come up, this question of what if a woman wants to do a mitzvah that she's exempt from? Is she allowed to? Right? We know that there's certain mitzvah that women generally don't do, even though they're exempt from, right? And generally we say women can do time-bound mitzvahs if they want to. There are some that women don't do. Again, there's different opinions about all these things, but the Rabbeinu Tam basically says that most of these mitzvot, if a woman wants to do them, she can. And then the question becomes, right? Many of the sources say she can. The question is, does she make a bracha if she does, right? So there's a range of opinions whether is she allowed to or not allowed to. If she is allowed to, does she make a blessing on them? Many Sephardi poskim say you don't make a blessing on them. There's a bit of a split between Sephardi poskim, whether they do or whether they don't. Ashkenazim generally hold that they do make a bracha. Now, if you make a bracha, then obviously the point is, even though she's exempt, she still could fulfill the mitzvah, and therefore it's not muktzah for her. So that's that. It's two ways about how to read this kamash malan. Katani odea l'na'aneh. So now Tana Rabbanan, they're going to bring a long braita with all different ages for different mitzvot and different, I would say, not even necessarily mitzvot, other related things. Katan, like impurity and things like that. Katani odea l'na'aneh chayav belulav. Katan, who knows how to shake. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, this shows that shaking is a critical part of the mitzvah, because it should say a katani odea litol, to carry a lulav. This shows you how important shaking the lulav is as part of the mitzvah. Okay, next. Litatef, if he could put his clothes on, get dressed, chayav b'tzitzit, they're already chayav in tzitzit. Lishmor tfilav, if he can take care of his tefillin. Aviv lokach lo tefillin. Notice the wording is a little different here. The father buys him a set of tefillin once he can take care of them. Yodea lidaber, once he can speak. Aviv lomdo Torah. His father teaches him Torah. Vikriat shma, and shma. Torah mahi, what do we mean by Torah, right? What kind of Torah can you teach a kid who's just learning how to speak? Many people understand this. You teach him that line, that sentence. Okay, why is this sentence so critical? First of all, if you notice in the Gan, usually this is one of the first things the kids learn. They learn Modani, and they learn Torah Tzivalanu Moshe Morasha Kirat Yaakov. I remember still the tune, we used to sing it as kids. Then some people say that, right, so why this pasuk? Some people explain it a little bit differently, but let's assume it means read this pasuk. What is the meaning of this pasuk? It's all about that the Torah is a tradition. It was passed down by inheritance, and it's one of the main things we always try to teach our kids about we're a link in the chain, and it's all right. It's all based on this tradition that's been passed down for generations, and that's really described in this verse. Kriyat Shema Maihi. What about Kriyat Shema? Right, a little kid who just learned to talk can't necessarily read all of Shema. So pasuk rishon, the first verse. But with this whole debate, what part of Shema is actually obligation by Torah law? Some people say just the first verse. This maybe would support that. Hayodeh lishmor gufo. If you can already watch your body from impurities, from getting impure, you understand the concept of impurity. You can protect your body from impurities. Then we assume that ochlim al gufo taharot. If his body touched food, you can still eat that food. You can assume it's pure. You don't have to worry. This is assuming that you eat al kedushat, right, al taharat kodesh, they call it, or al taharat truma, that many of the prushim in those days made sure to eat all their food with a level of impurity, or maybe it's relating to only kohanim who eat their truma. It has to be pure, so you can assume that it's pure. Lishmor, but notice it's just his body, but you can't necessarily, people's hands touch everything. We always say yadayim maskaniot, that's why we wash our hands before we eat bread, to remember the way they did, because hands were always dirty. But l'shmor yadav, ochlim al yadav tahorot. But if he already knows how to wash his hands and be careful about them, then if his hands touch something, we don't have to assume that it's impure. Hayodeh lishael, if you can ask him, did you touch impurity? And he can answer you, yes, I know I did or I didn't. Then what if he passed through somewhere he's not sure if he became impure by it or not? Let's say you didn't know if he passed over the dead body. There was a dead body in a field. He's not sure exactly which way he went in the field, if he passed over it or not. Then this is a classic law of Bereshut hayachid sfekot tameh, Bereshut harabim sfekot tahor. If it's in the public domain, we assume he didn't. If it's in private, we assume he didn't and he's impure. And this is because it's all learned out from the sota. Sota is a woman who went into a room with a man who her husband suspected her of sleeping with. And then after she was warned, she went into a room with him alone in a private domain. Therefore, if it happens, and it says there, she's a case of safek. We don't know, did she sleep with him or did she not? And the Torah uses the words, im nitma or im lo nitma. Did she become impure to him or did she not? Where even though it's not relating to impurity, the idea is they learn from here, the safek about the sota is only if she was alone in a room with him in private. It's not a safek if she's in public. So therefore they learn from there two laws of purity and impurity as well. Lifros kapav, hayodeh lifros kapav, if he knows how to duchen, do the Birkat Kohanim, the blessing of the priests. Cholkim lo truma bebeit hakranot. You can give him truma if he's in the granary. That's where they would give out the truma to all the Kohanim. He can go online and get truma. If he's not old enough, what's the issue? Once he does the Birkat Kohanim, everybody sees him up there and knows that he's old enough to do that. That means that he's old enough to treat the truma with the proper respect. Otherwise, they won't give truma to little kids because they don't trust little kids. And it's like a disgrace to the truma. Truma has to be kept in a particular way and treated a particular way. It's sanctified food. So therefore, we wouldn't give it to a child. At what point? Well, once he's up there and everybody sees him going up to do Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing, everyone knows he's already old enough and therefore he can stand on the line. Hayodea lishchot, if you can slaughter, ochlim mishchitato, so you can eat from meat that this child slaughtered. Amar Rav Huna, but Rav Huna comes and says, no, that's only v'husha gadol omer agabav. You have to have an older person watching to make sure he does it correctly. Just because he knows how to do the moves doesn't necessarily mean, right? I'm thinking of like kids learning to cut and gun and with scissors, they know how to cut. It doesn't necessarily mean they know all the laws of shchita. Yachol echol kezayit dagan. This is a totally different issue. By the way, there's already a split between these issues. Some are, when is he obligated in a mitzvah? And others affect other people, right? Those just affected him. You have to take a lulav. But when it comes to, can you slaughter for other people? Or things that you touched, are they pure or impure? That affects other people as well. And now we're talking about another different issue, which is once he can eat, this isn't a mitzvah at all, once he can eat kezayit agan, once he can eat an olive bulk of one of the grains, the 5 grains. Marchikim mitzoato mimei raglav arba amot. If you're davening, you have to be within 4 amot of the child if, let's say, their diaper is full, is wet or dirty. This shows that when a child is young, it's very important halacha, especially for young moms. So who are nursing or with their children, they can daven even if the diaper is dirty because, right, when they're very little, because that's not considered real waste until they actually start eating solid foods. And then we're going to learn, number 1, has to be they can eat a kezayit of dagan, of wheat, of one of the grains. And Amar Rav Chisda, he limits it even to say, it's not just eating, because when little children eat, right, babies, they start eating, it could take an hour or half an hour to feed them a little bowl of that, rice pudding or whatever it is that they eat. But if, right, well, rice isn't even one of the grains, but let's say one of those oatmeal type things you're feeding the children. But if they have to eat it within that time, it takes to eat a half a loaf of bread, which is usually 9 minutes. So if they can eat it within that time, then already their waste is considered proper waste, that you can't be davening nearby. But if it's more than that, then it's right. If it's less than that and they can't eat in that period of time, then it's actually fine. You don't have to move away. But once they're already old enough, different ways of understanding this. Some people even say if other kids their age could do that and they can't eat that quickly because they're weak or they're sick or something like that, that's still going to be a problem. Okay, then it's treated as if it's a gadol. How gadol you have to be to consider this gadol. Some people say it's when they're 6 or 7 years old. There's different opinions about this exactly, but even though, right, we would assume it's a much younger age. But the point is, if they're a certain age and they're sick and they can't eat that much food, you can't put down that much food, right? We know when we're sick, vomiting, can't really put down a lot of food, keep down food. Still, then, if you have some waste, that will be a problem. Tichtiv, they quote this pasuk, which is a little hard to understand how they connect it. Yosif dat, Yosif machov. As you get older and you add more knowledge, you add more pain. I guess the idea is that the pain is, it's more painful, and then you have trouble eating, but you're still old. Not 100% clear how they connect that verse to the idea. Next halacha, you can eat a kezayit of roasted meat. Shochatina lavet Pesach. We slaughter the korban Pesach for you, meaning we count you as part of the chabura. Remember, you have to reserve in advance. You're counted in part of that count. Shenemar ish lefi achlo, because it says each person according to what they eat. Now, it means a little something different in the simple reading, but they say, if you can eat, then you're considered an ish for this. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he says, well, not exactly. You have to be able to be discerning with food. What does this mean? It doesn't mean like you'll eat your mother's meat, you won't eat other people's meat, right? Like, it's not as good as my mom's. No, not that kind of discerning. But ketzad, notnim lo tzror v'zorko egos v'notzlo. You have to be at a stage where if they give you a rock, you throw it, and if they give you a nut, you eat it. Okay, right? Kids generally put everything in their mouth. I have a daughter who once swallowed a marble, right? It wasn't so pleasant, but right, she thought, I don't know if she thought it was food, but she treated it like food. That age, you would not be response, right? You wouldn't be, even though theoretically she could have eaten meat at that point. But you have to be discerning when it comes to food, what's not food. With that, Hadron alach lulav gazul, and we're now starting the fourth chapter. Only one more after this. Lulav arava shisha v'shiv'a. Okay, lulav and arava are taken either 6 days or 7 days. We're talking about in times of the temple. Okay, we'll talk about what this lulav is taking the lulav, right, which we know. The arava in the mikdash, in the temple, they would take for 7 days. Okay, either 6 or 7. We're going to see in the Mishnah when 6, when 7. The arava is that they would, again, we talked about this before, they would put aravot, they would stand them up around the altar, and then they would shake the aravot and walk around every day one time. And on the last day of Sukkot, which we call Hoshana Rabbah, they would go around 7 times. So these are either 6 or 7 days. Hahalel, v'hasimcha shmona. This is a classic Mishnah where they like to number things and they put numbers to everything. Hallel, you say for 8 days. Okay, this is because Sukkot is only 7 days, but there's Shmini Atzeret, which is the 8th day, which is considered a separate holiday, right? For certain parts, it's kind of like the holiday of Sukkot, but for example, you don't sit in Sukkah, you don't take lulav and etrog. That's why it doesn't say lulav shmona. Arava, you don't do either, but you do Hallel, and you do have a mitzvah of simcha. Rashi says the mitzvah of simcha is le'echol basar shlamim. They would bring extra, what we call shalmei simcha, peace offerings to the temple and eat the meat all 8 days of the holiday. It's a mitzvah to do that, right? But besides the 7 days of Sukkot, also on the 8th day, it's holiday. It's a mitzvah of simcha. The Rambam actually says, right, the question is, there's other sources that talk about the mitzvah of simcha nowadays being, right, eating meat and wine, and also for men, it's meat and wine. For the women, it's buying them new clothing. For the children, it's having, giving them out treats. Like there it was klayot and egozim, roasted grains and nuts. So the Rambam views that actually as doraita, and that's the mitzvah of simcha, and it's a mitzvah all 8 days, which almost sounds like you have to buy clothes, let's say for women, or maybe all 8 days, 8 days. Anyway, the Rambam has it that. Many people say that's Rabbanit. Here they're talking about the mitzvah of these Shalmei Simcha when the temple was around. Sukkah v'nisuch hamayim shiva. Sitting in the sukkah is 7 days. Nisuch hamayim, pouring the water libations, which again we saw that Rashi, and as he says it as well here, was part of the Tamid sacrifice in the morning, not the afternoon. Other people don't view it as part of the Tamid sacrifice. It was just this water libation. They would pour water every day, not necessarily connected with the sacrifice, but they would do it in the morning. Ha-chalil chamisha. The Chalil was part of the Simchat Beis HaShoeva, which Rashi says, why did they do the Simchat Beis HaShoeva, where they would have musical instruments? It was part of the Nisuch HaMayim. But others actually don't connect it to the Nisuch HaMayim, and they say, no, it was part of the Simcha, the holiday. They would play musical instruments and have music in these celebrations, not necessarily connected to the water libation. So there's a debate also about that, what the Simchat Beis HaShoeva was. Was it connected to the water libations, or was it something different? But that would only happen 5 days, and we'll see why, either 5, or 6. Chamisha v'shisha, depending obviously on whether Shabbat and Yom Tov fell on the same day or on different days, because if Shabbat falls on Yom Tov, then 6 days. If Shabbat and Yom Tov are separate, you don't play musical instruments, not on Shabbat, not on Yom Tov, it would drop it down to 5. Lulav shiv'a ketzad. So now the Mishnah explains the first number. Lulav and arava, shisha and shiv'a. Why? Yom Tov rishon shel chag shechal liyot b'Shabbat. If the first day of Yom Tov falls on Shabbat, lulav shiv'a, then you take the lulav 7. Because remember, in the time of the temple, they took the lulav even on the first day, if it was, they took the lulav even if the first day fell on Shabbat. We're going to get much more into detail about that later, why, how, etc. Ushar kol hayamim shisha. Shar kol hayamim doesn't mean all the other days 6. What do you mean? There's only 6 days left. What it means is all other years. If Shabbat comes out in the middle of the week, the lulav doesn't override Shabbat. You don't take the lulav at all, and you end up with only 6 days that you took a lulav. Arava shiva ketzad. This is going to be the reverse. Yom HaShvi'i on Hoshana Rabbah. Yom HaShvi'i shel arava shechal liyot b'Shabbat. Then you would arava shiva. Then you would take it when the arava falls out, and later the Gemara is going to question why is it the last day and not the other days. We'll see later in the Gemara, not today. Ushar kol hayamim shishan, and all other years it will be 6. Because again, it only overrides Shabbat if Shabbat comes out on day number 7, which by the way, nowadays won't come out anymore, and the Gemara is actually going to talk about that. But in the time of the Mishnah, they didn't have a set calendar, it could happen. Mitzvah lulav ketzad. So how do you do the mitzvah of lulav on Shabbat? Yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag Shechal Liyot b'Shabbat. If that were happen, we actually had a Mishnah that described this, but it described it in the shul. Now we're going to describe it in the temple, and we're going to see there's a big difference. Remember, in the shul, they would bring all their lulavim, everyone would put it somewhere and distinguish his from everyone else's, and everyone would come the next morning and take their own. But in the temple, that was obviously harder to do because many more people came to the temple and there wasn't as much place to put everything. So, and you can imagine it being a big mess. So, in fact, we're going to see this. This is going to be a Mishnah similar to Yoma about the dangers that happen and the fighting that might have ensued. So let's read. So first we have the basic halacha, which is they would be molichim lulavehem lahar habayit, v'chazanim mekablim mehem. You would bring everything before Shabbat to the Har Habayit, to the Temple Mount. The chazanim, there were people in charge who would accept all of them. V'sodrim otam al gabei itztaba. They would put them in this area, these benches that had a covered space, so they were protected from, I guess, getting destroyed by the sun. Zkenim, the elders would put it in a special place. Everyone else's would go together. And then they would teach everyone to say the following. Anyone whose lulav gets to my hands, anyone who my lulav gets into his hands, it will be a gift to him. In other words, gifted already now. Say, whoever picks up my lulav, it's a gift to him. And that way, everyone would come tomorrow. Mashkimim ubaim, they would get up early and come. V'chazanim, now there's a funny thing. Zorkim otam lifnehem, they kind of throw them in front of everybody. I imagine they didn't really literally throw them, but I think the idea is they would kind of place them out. And hen mechatfin umakin ishet chavero. What happened though? When they did this, okay, so they would tell everyone and have everyone prepared. And the idea is everyone would come and just pick a set. Sounds nice, but you can imagine hordes of people coming. Everybody was on the Aliyah L'Regel, and they get there and they start, everybody's scared they're not going to get one, and maybe they want their own, right? I bought it, I spent my own money, and I want my own lulav. Well, they started fighting and hitting, right? They started grabbing because everyone's worried they're not going to get one. You can imagine they have lulavs in their hands. It's quite dangerous to be close to someone with their lulav, and they started getting into whether they actually hit on purpose or they just ended up hordes of people get together. You can imagine what happens. Unfortunately, we had situations like this recently in Israel. Very dangerous. Just like in Yoma, when the rabbis saw that this was causing dangerous situation, they said, you know what? Everybody take in your own house. Don't bring it to the temple. We don't need to have a lulav in the temple. Everybody take your lulav in your house, make a bracha, and be done with it. And remember this takana, we're going to come back to this later. Amai. So now the Gemara starts off with the first question. The lulav is really only an issue of muktzah. There's really nothing wrong with it. So if that's the case, why doesn't the mitzvah of lulav in the mikdash on all the other days override Shabbat? Why don't we say any day of, right, any time, whatever day of the week Shabbat falls out, it should override. Because remember, there's a mitzvah from the Torah to take it in the mikdash all 7 days. So why not? So Amar Rabba, and Rabba says, right, and this is also nowadays, right? The same thing nowadays, you would have this question, why don't we take a lulav on Shabbat? So the famous reason is this Gzera de Rabba. It's not really that he instituted the Gzera, he just explains why the Mishnah said it's no good. Rabba says, we're worried that maybe you'll take your lulav in your hand. You'll go to someone to learn how to do it. And then you'll carry it by accident 4 cubits of Reshut HaRabim. Now, this isn't Ta'abit Bar Mitzvah because you're just learning how to do it. V'hainu Tama de Shofar, v'hainu Tama de Megillah. We actually saw in other sources a few other things included in this Zera de Rabba, but here it quotes also Shofar, also Megillah. Same thing, that you can't take them because we're worried that you might go to someone to teach you how to blow the shofar, to teach you how to read the Megillah, and teach you how to shake the lulav. And therefore, right, it's interesting. Shaking the lulav is a lot easier to learn than all these others. You don't really need an expert to teach you. But again, maybe people didn't know it. And he said, that's what we're worried about. We're worried that you're going to carry it in Reshut HaRabim, and it's a doraita, not a dorabanan, a muktzah. It's actually a halacha, again, in Torah, forbidden by Torah to carry in public domain, so that you don't accidentally do that, we're going to institute that no one's going to take it on Shabbat, except for, again, in the temple on day number 1, we're going to make an exception. We're going to have to see why that is. That's going to be the Gemara's next question. So wait for tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone.